So our first speaker is in attendance on our Zoom. And just real quick, I'm sure that Dan will say some stuff about himself, but Daniel Brown is a watershed planner with the Huron River Watershed Council, who I know there's a lot of kayakers, at least in this group here. We all appreciate everything they do to keep our waterways safe and functioning for us. He coordinates the Huron River Water Trail and projects to revitalize the whole river corridor, and he is also heading their efforts to address PFAS. As you know, we had quite an issue and quite a scare with PFAS, and when we were still meeting back at the shack, we had a wonderful speaker who spoke about that and what we could do to test for PFAS and filter PFAS in our home environments. So they do have a number of legislative priorities that he'll be addressing: polluter pay, yay, land protection, septic codes. It's amazing how many communities, I guess, do not have septic codes. And I don't know how many of you in this room are on septic, but I am, and I'm a total septic phobic. So it's a scary thing for me. Stormwater utilities and dam removals. So hopefully he will have a lot of great information to share with us, and I'm going to let him roll, and then he can say some things about himself if I miss something. Welcome, Dan.
Yeah, so Daniel Brown here on River Watershed Council. I'm a watershed planner. My training is actually in climatology and physics. So I came up through kind of an unorthodox pathway to get where I am. But environmental protection has always been sort of at my core and at the heart of what I've been interested in doing. For those that don't know much about our organization, so we are a watershed council as defined by state law. There was a state law that was passed in the 60s that basically gave local governments the authority to create these quasi-governmental organizations called watershed councils. So our board is made up of representatives of constituent communities, but they have basically just an advisory role. Otherwise, we operate like a nonprofit. So we have executive director, staff, and most of our funding comes from donations and grants and that sort of thing. But we represent communities mostly in Oakland, Livingston, Washtenaw, Wayne, and Monroe counties. We're based out of Ann Arbor and have been actively trying to reach basically beyond Washtenaw County with a lot of our efforts, or at least to communities that have been historically underserved throughout the whole watershed. And there's a lot of great stuff that we can do, particularly in Oakland and Livingston counties, which a lot of our policy priorities coming up speak directly to those types of things. A little background on the river: it's 130 miles, we'll call it. Starts, if you really want to kind of trace the main stem of the river as far as you can go, it goes all the way up to Big Lake, which is up by Indian Springs Metro Park. Winds down through Milford, as you know, goes past Dexter, through Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, and then eventually out to Lake Erie. So it kind of wraps around western Metro Detroit. So Huron River Watershed Council was founded in 1965. One of our first sort of major policy issues that we got involved in was actually supporting passage of the Clean Water Act. And this was an early demonstration that HRWC participated in near the University of Michigan campus, where basically led a march along the river. So we've had a long history of being involved in advocacy and policy throughout the state. And we've been really fortunate to have people like John Dingle and other environmental champions that had a footprint that overlapped with our own and have been able to rely on some really key elected officials through the years to get things done. I will say that in more recent years, we've taken on more of a scientific and technical role, which I'll talk about in a second. So we really rely on partner groups to work with grassroots and mobilize. And the hexavalent chromium scare, which we had recently, really highlighted that for us, where our strengths are as a convener, kind of working at the grass tops between state regulatory agencies, the feds, elected officials, and that sort of thing. But to really get groups together quickly for demonstrations or protests, or to mobilize around letter signing campaigns, things like that, we really rely on folks like you all and Sierra clubs and things like that. So there's a lot of room for partnership with our organization and others to advance things that protect the environment. If I'm trying to summarize what we do, there's quite a lot, but it really kind of comes down, I think, to these 6 categories that I have on the screen. So we basically do a lot of scientific monitoring, which I consider sort of our bread and butter, because that kind of informs everything else that we advocate for and all of the actions that we take. I'm always writing grants to do watershed management planning or to advance a restoration project. One of our folks, Chris Olson, who I'm sure many of you have crossed paths with in the past, is really passionate about natural areas preservation. And so these are all things that we do, but at the heart of it, we are a science-based organization, and we really rely on our monitoring efforts, which pull in a lot of volunteers to understand what we need to do to protect the river. With that in mind, I wanted to talk about those five policy priorities that we've highlighted recently in our newsletter. And we could go into each one of these and spend a long time in each one of these, but I'll just take a couple minutes on each, and then leave plenty of time for questions. So the top priority of the moment is something you've probably all heard about, which is polluter pay, or as we're calling it, polluter accountability. And the reason that we're not calling it polluter pay so specifically is that there's more accountability that needs to happen. And if we just call it polluter pay, we kind of leave out a big part of the issue. So big thing that we need is that we just need stronger laws to prevent and pollution and enforce protection. So in the 1990s, Michigan had some of the strongest environmental protection in the country, and we were the envy of other states. Other states were looking at Michigan as a model of how you do waterway protection and environmental protection. And there's a really interesting history there, because Governor Engler initially supported a lot of those steps, and then Chamber of Commerce, Michigan Manufacturers Association got to him, and he completely flipped. And since then, we've seen this 30, 40-year erosion of environmental laws through legislative action, executive orders that direct and convolute regulators' role in all of this. But then we've also seen court cases make some really illogical judgments that have really messed things up. So we're in a very different place from where we used to be. And I think that's something that a lot of longtime voters really don't understand, is that our laws are really quite weak compared to other states, but then also certainly compared to how they used to be. So we need to make the laws stronger. We need to give regulators more authority to enforce their existing laws. And this comes up really constantly when we're talking to kind of middle manager, on the ground level people in those regulatory agencies, is that in all of these different ways, polluters can essentially delay enforcement, run out the clock, shift the burden of responsibility and investigation on the state agencies and taxpayers and other entities. So one big part of this is that we just need to clean up the existing laws that we have and basically streamline those, make them as clear-cut as possible. At the heart of this, it's making polluters pay to cover for cleanup where there are clearly liable parties. So if you have a responsible party, like a tri-bar or a Gelman Sciences, where that's been determined, it's pretty straightforward what needs to happen. You want them to pay for the cleanup, you want to hold them very strictly accountable, and you need strict laws to do that. Where it gets a little bit murkier and where we shift to calling it polluter accountability is that we also need to be able to cover the risk of having orphan sites. So there are 24,000 contaminated sites now in Michigan after 40 years of weak pollution laws. I think about 14,000 of those are truly orphan, where there's no responsible party. And Eagle and the EPA have funding and staffing to do hundreds of those sites. So we're adding more contaminated sites per year than we are addressing. It's much easier to pollute something than it is to clean it up. So where it stands now, the cost of dishonesty by these polluters is cheaper than doing the right thing, and we need to reverse that. One option that we are thinking about is basically having a trust fund or some kind of standing rolling fund that any entity that is handling or using toxic chemicals pays into based on some assessment of risk. So it's basically this statewide insurance policy that would cover the cost of cleaning up a site if it's potentially orphaned. And as the total number of sites comes down, that total cost to industry could be relieved over time. But up front, we have a lot of sites, a lot of risk, and a lot of potential cost shifted onto taxpayers if something goes wrong. So that's a summary of kind of where things stand now. It's very complicated to do this in a way that is sustainable, resilient, and able to withstand legal challenges. So that's where a lot of the legal minds that are far smarter than I am are thinking about this right now. But that's where we stand. So you'll be hearing a lot about polluter pay, polluter accountability. Senator Jeffer in our watershed is a real champion of this. So you'll be almost certainly hearing more from him about that. One of the major driving factors that's lending urgency to polluter pay is PFAS, and I can talk about PFAS for a really long time, and I won't go into it because this is what I spend a lot of my days doing. The summary on PFAS is that they are a family of thousands of chemicals. They're used in every sector you can think of, everything from dental floss to Teflon to bike chain lubricant to vinyl siding, anything that you can think of, there's probably PFAS, waterproofing in your clothing, et cetera, et cetera. The science is trending very clearly that they are far more toxic than previously thought. The recent EPA health advisory levels and then the drinking water standards really demonstrate just how toxic they are. But we also know that they're far more pervasive than we thought that they were. So they're on the top of Mount Everest, they're in rainwater, they've been found in Great Lakes snowpack and really remote areas. So they move around an ecosystem, and they're able to do that because they don't break down. So once they're in the environment, they cycle through plants and wildlife. They're picked up by weather and lifted and deposited elsewhere. This is a cumulative problem, very similar to climate change or other things, where the solution really is to stop doing the thing that's causing the problem. So the longer we continue to use PFAS, the more harm they will cause. So ultimately, what we're looking at is the need to ban non-essential production and use of PFAS. Before we get there, we need to make sure that we're accounting for the pollution that's in the system and basically limiting people's exposure. And this is lending urgency to polluter pay in a really fundamental way, because there's growing evidence that PFAS are contributing to many of the long-term global health crises and sort of unexplained questions that we have in public health at a massive scale. So when people ask me, what things do I fear the most, it's climate change, PFAS, and plastics. And with that, microplastics is something else that we are focused on at the Watershed Council. The science on this is far less settled. Other than that, we know plastics building up in the environment is bad in myriad ways. But the human health impacts are not extraordinarily well known. It's something like we all ingest something like a credit card worth of plastic every week or something like that. So there's a lot of plastic going through our bodies all the time, and it's just not clear what effect that has on a lot of things, other than that we know that it disrupts biological processes, and it's not good to have these unnatural things obstructing ecological functions. But this is a picture of Paul Steen on the right, and I think that's one of our volunteers who's helping collect microplastics with these giant bug net looking things, these really fine nets. And then there's a receptacle at the very far end that's submerged in this picture that helps collect those microplastics. So to my knowledge, we were one of the first rivers that really looked at microplastics and tried to quantify where they're coming from. And the short answer is we really don't know. We know they're coming from clothing, but we don't have much sense beyond that. And I think the answer is that they're probably just coming from everything that is plastic, could be breaking down in one way or another to give these microscopic plastic fibers that are left behind. So this is something else that we're going to need to do things like ban plastic bags, kind of all the low-hanging fruit to get ahead of this, because this is another cumulative problem. Having these build up and not break down indefinitely is just not sustainable. Some other things which I'll go through a little bit more quickly, but they are really important. So when we think about climate change impacts, community resilience, when you think about climate change in Michigan, it is all about water. And I say that having studied climate change in Michigan and in the northeastern part of the United States, is that given our relationship to the Great Lakes, our relationship to rain and snow, climate change is all about how it's going to change water and precipitation. And the short of it is that we should expect more precipitation over the long term in general, but we will also have a greater chance of these real deep dry spells, followed by sort of these punishing, damaging rainstorms. And the way that we need to deal with that is to really build our systems to handle dynamic climate conditions over time. There's not going to be something that we can build and just leave it there. We're not going to be able to build a cistern to take up so much more water if it's just continually changing and moving around. So we have to rely on natural systems or systems that mimic natural systems to handle stormwater. So it's a lot of green infrastructure, but it's also doing things like not paving driveways, not paving roads, or using pervious pavement where it's possible to do that. So stormwater utilities help with that, because if they are implemented like a utility, they're charged and rated based on how much pervious impervious surface you have on your properties. If you have a really long paved wide driveway, you're going to be paying a little bit more into that stormwater utility because you're contributing a little bit more to runoff than if you have, say, a gravel narrow driveway. They've been really effective at reducing the impacts of stormwater, getting groundwater infiltration. And if you want an example, there's no better example, I think, in the country than the city of Ann Arbor. They were really out in front on this. Septic systems are a huge problem across the state of Michigan. Michigan is really kind of curious in that we have a large percentage of our population on drinking water wells and septic systems, even in parts of the state where relatively suburban, relatively close to a sewer system or a municipal drinking water source. So when other states look at us, they're really kind of puzzled by that. We also have a lot of lakes, Oakland County being a perfect example, where we have a lot of development near and around lakes. So throughout Oakland, Livingston, and parts of Washtenaw County, we have a lot of developments that are on septic systems very near a lake or the river. And over time, those individual septic systems fail, nutrient, bacterial contamination leaches out into the groundwater, which then eventually makes its way to the surface water. So there are a number of lakes where we see E. coli problems, nutrient loading problems, and septic systems are suspected in those cases. But what we're seeing here is really indicative of what we see elsewhere across the state. So we're also odd in that we do not have a statewide septic code, and lots of environmental organizations have been calling that for many years. It's something we say, it's this infrastructural solution that's really not sexy. It's not something politicians like to talk about, but geez, we really need a statewide septic code, and it's kind of embarrassing that we don't have it. I'll talk about land protection. So this is something I'm really passionate about, but a lot of our team is. In the most recent national and international climate studies, land protection is basically sort of the third category of importance behind decarbonizing transportation, decarbonizing built infrastructure and buildings, and then you want to protect essentially as much land as possible. And in what we call kind of the sprawl frontier around Metro Detroit, so especially in parts of like Livingston and Oakland County, we really want to protect as much land as possible. And particularly, we want to protect wetland area because the carbon sequestration potential of wetlands in Southeast Michigan is greater per acre than rainforests. So we actually have more carbon sequestration potential per acre than some of the richest, most lush ecosystems on the planet. So they're really carbon assets for us. But beyond that, IPCC and others basically recommend that, for every acre of land that we're developing, we should be protecting about an acre of land nearby in a similar ecosystem. So you've probably heard things like protect half of the earth or follow a 30 by 30 policy. And those are good strategies to really get baked into local ordinances wherever possible. Pursuing smart development, limiting the footprint of buildings so that you can protect more of the native tree canopy in the natural landscape. The last policy thing I'll talk about is dam removal. This is another thing I spend a lot of my professional time on. Most dams are obsolete relics in Michigan. They harm the environment and they don't have a practical purpose. There's kind of this misconception that most dams used to provide hydropower. And if a dam provided hydropower in the past in Michigan, it probably provided hydropower for a business that was like right next to the power generation facility. And in some cases, they provided mechanical power along with that, but they're really not suitable for generating power for the grid in the vast majority of cases. So only a tiny fraction of dams produce enough power to be worth it, or if you're looking at the balance of harm caused to the river ecosystem, you need to produce a lot of power to really make that environmental trade-off worth it. To give you a yardstick on this, Consumers Energy wants to remove basically all of their huge dams along the Manistee and the Au Sable River corridors, because even at that scale, they're not producing enough power to justify the cost versus wind and solar, which are just becoming so much more efficient and have so many fewer liabilities and so fewer costs associated with them. So there's kind of this misconception that dams were green. Green power sources, I would really say that they are sort of greenish. And there's been a recognition of that amongst state and federal agencies. So there's been this surge in dam removals over time across the country. On your screen right now is a picture of the Mill Creek Park, which used to be the location of Mill Pond, which was a dam in Dexter. So if you're interested in seeing just like what does a dam removal, potentially offer to the landscape over time, this is about 3 or 4 years. This picture was taken after the dam removal. So you can see it revegetates pretty quickly. City of Dexter also put in a boardwalk there. And it's really become sort of a community gathering place and a community center for Dexter, but for areas around. So really a good success story for dam removal down in Dexter. We're working on the dam removal of the Peninsula Paper Dam in Ypsilanti right now. And there's a couple other that are in much earlier stages. So this is one of the things that when you get an opportunity to remove a dam, it's really worth looking at, because there are few things that we can do that can improve community resilience to climate change in a way that dam removal does. It's just sort of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to community to take out one of these liability hazards when you have the chance. But they are complicated. You have to look at them at a case-by-case basis. But this is something we need a lot more funding for. So it's a policy priority for us.
So we can take a few questions. Do we have questions? Yeah. Mike.
I know in downtown Milford, we've had that mill pond, Kelsey Hayes contamination from 60 years ago. Does he have any information on that? Does anybody know anything about where that's at, and is that stabilized, or is it still an issue? Or
nothing probably that you don't already know. So it is a long-term site, long-term remediation efforts. There's nothing new that I've heard of related to PFAS or any of the new contamination issues that have come up recently. But it is indicative of all these other sites that we have across the state. That progress on cleanup, remediation, even identifying the sites and what's needed at those types of sites is really slow. So figuring out ways to fund those and streamline the process for cleanups is really critical.
Thanks.
I have a little confession to make. I worked for General Motors real estate staff for 30+ years, and we did all kinds of environmental cleanups. So I was involved in a lot of different things, like Quail Hollow out there, from the proving grounds when the underground gasoline tank ruptured and they wanted buying out like 100 houses from the. But I had another couple of questions. How do you compare the PFAS contamination with the mercury contaminations that we've been dealing with over the last 50, 60, 70 years? And also, with the DDT contaminations?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard to say. It's hard to say what of the bad things which one is worse, because they're all bad and they can all hurt you in some way. So it's there's no good side to that, or no reprieve. What worries me about PFAS specifically, which is in some ways similar to DDT and some of the other contaminants that have hit Michigan in the past, is that they do last a really long time, and they are, like many things that are really dangerous to humans, they have this slow burning effect. So there's not, unless you're really exposed to something high level, there's not usually an acute effect that you see from PFAS. It's prolonged exposure. The health effects are more similar to what you would get from smoking or other chronic exposure. Can give you cancer over time and things like that. You compare that to something like mercury or lead, where there are these more acute effects that you can see in a matter of years. So we have kids up in Flint that have their development has been slowed by exposure to lead, things like that. PFAS is different from those types of exposures because they are so long-lived, and they can have such this pervasive effect that builds up in the body over many years. So they're more of a silent risk than some of these others that are more acute and more alarming when they happen as an immediate risk. But I mean, there is this broader question about following the precautionary principle versus putting the burden on groups to prove that a harm has been committed. And the United States is, I'm sure many of you have probably heard, like we are very backwards compared to how things are done in many European countries, where use of a product has to be determined safe before it's used widely through many European countries. And we're the opposite. We use something until it's proven that it can be harmful. And like what we've seen is 3M and other companies really hide those effects and basically wait until the negative health effects are discovered, and then they move on to something else.
So innocent until proven guilty works in the legal system, not so much in the ecology system.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunately the way we operate in this country. One more question, maybe? Okay. Okay, Jim, and then come on up here if you'd like. Yeah, because you have a very soft voice. You can come up.
I was just going to ask you about the polluter accountability. Is there any criminal legislation anywhere in the states that is going to make it a criminal offense rather than just the civil suits?
So there are, it depends. There's nothing new in the packages that I've seen proposed, because they're mostly going after polluting entities. But there are laws on the books that if somebody did something really nefarious, if you showed intent to harm, basically, or if you're sabotaging something, then you get into sort of a whole other set of criminal laws. So one example of that was at Tribar, where it's still not totally clear if Tribar was trying to create a scapegoat with one employee that overrode the alarms hundreds of times in a short period, which led to the hexavalent chromium scare. If he was doing that intentionally, that is criminal. That was basically an act of sabotage that endangered an entire watershed. I'm a little skeptical of Tribar's take on that, because when you actually read their account of it, it sounds like the employee kind of had some direction to override the alarm. So it's a little bit mixed on that. But there are there are things that people could do to be held accountable as criminals, but it's a little separate from the polluter accountability packages that we're talking about.
Well, Dan, I was just trying to think if there was a legislator that was trying to take up that issue. Because Tri-Bar was what I was thinking about. Because that was an intentional, I believe, an intentional attempt to pollute, to save costs. And there should be maybe some kind of criminal legislation, and maybe I'm just screaming.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a criminal investigation that was underway right after the scare. I actually don't know where that ended. We saw basically the result of the enforcement, which was came out in the permit and was really pretty anemic and weak. But I don't know where the criminal investigation ended. That is, as I recall, it was actually handled by the DNR because they have the conservation officer, law enforcement. So that's very different, and everybody was very tight-lipped with us about what was
Just
happening.
add to your bucket of frustration.
Yeah.
Hey, one more. Do you want to ask a real quick question?
Yeah, I'll speak up a little bit.
Oh, okay.
It just sounds like you need endless funding for everything. And, I'm wondering what's your best source? How do you intend on getting more funding? Who's in your way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So polluters should pay for this is the short answer. So we really need to have some sort of revolving fund or some other policy where they are paying into the system in taxes or some other way based on the risk that they're bringing to the work that they're doing. Beyond that, well, the polluters need to pay, and really, I think that is the solution, is that there has to be some sort of rolling fund that they're paying into and being held accountable. There are ways that we could make it easier for state officials to win in court just by clarifying laws and things like that. So recouping state costs from investigations could also be a really effective deterrent. And that gets to basically strengthening the laws we have and giving Eagle and the other agencies more enforcement authority.
So just to wrap up, thank you, Daniel. This has been really great. We have one other speaker to get to, but real quick, if we were to do as an activist group one thing, what do you see as our most effective action going forward?
Yeah, right now, I think the two things that are kind of in the moment are talking to elected officials at every level of government, local up to federal, telling them to support polluter pay, to talk to each other about how to hold polluters accountable, really get polluter accountability, polluter pay in that daily vocabulary amongst leadership at all levels, but particularly amongst state officials. There's getting some odd intel that the priorities that the state officials are following right now don't necessarily match even what their internal polling is suggesting. So reminding them that environmental issues are really essential. Clean water, clean air, those are winning issues for anybody. So just beating that drum as much as possible, I think, is the core thing for the moment. And the other thing with Governor Whitmer's Healthy Climate Plan and all the buzz around that is just really making sure that we continue to emphasize land protection and funding for land protection within that. Yeah, thank you, everyone. And of course, you reach out to me if you have any other questions or want
Thank
that
you.
offline.
Thanks so much. All right, so we have another speaker zooming in. She's here. Oh, great. Unfortunately, she thought she could be here, but a number of family type issues. You know, we all get sick kids sometimes. It happens to the best of us. Thank goodness for technology. So our second speaker is Beth Wallace, and she's a manager of conservation partnerships with the National Wildlife Foundation in Ann Arbor. She grew up in Michigan in the Kalamazoo area and became aware of Enbridge with the Kalamazoo River fiasco that I'm sure we all remember, that involved another one of their pipelines and destroyed about 40 miles of river and took over 17 hours to even notice that there was a big spill going on. Those are all scary numbers to me. I don't know about anybody else. So I would like to introduce Beth Wallace, and I'll let her say something about herself and tell us what she's got going for us and give us some more action items.
Hi, thanks so much for having me and having me on Zoom. I appreciate it. As mentioned, well, before I start, how much time should I take? I know we're a little bit behind.
Beth, you can take whatever you need because we allocated a half hour for a business meeting and they don't want a half-hour business meeting. They would much rather listen to you. So you go right ahead and take the time that you need because I think it was important. I'm glad you were patient and for Dan's questions because I think that those were all really good questions. So just take the time that you need.
Yeah, double down on his recommendation on polluter pay too. Like that is a huge thing we need to get across the finish
It's
line.
huge. But if you leave me 10 or 15 minutes for a business meeting at the end, I'm good.
Okay, all right, then I will get through this. So I'm gonna skip quite a bit. I'm assuming this crowd has some background knowledge on line 5, but just some background on me. I'm of course with the National Wildlife Federation. I'm the Great Lakes Freshwater Campaigns Manager. I am also the director of the, I'm one of the managing directors for the Great Lakes Business Network, which is a coalition of businesses we help manage that speak out on in support of Great Lakes issues. We kind of look at them as the counter to the Chamber of Commerce on many issues. So that's a little bit about me. I'm also the board president for the Pipeline Safety Trust, which is a national organization that works on pipeline safety issues. And I came to this issue because of a spill that happened in the community I grew up in. I grew up near Battle Creek, Michigan. And in 2010, Enbridge's pipeline called Line 6B burst and spilled over 1 million gallons into a wetland that overfilled. That overfilled and hit a creek called Talmadge Creek. It was about 2 miles where the oil traveled down Talmadge Creek before it hit the Kalamazoo River. I think a lot of people think that spill actually happened in the Kalamazoo River, but it happened quite a distance away and just shows how vulnerable we are to these types of events. And it's why I've worked on pipelines ever since. And it's why I wanted to understand what other pipelines we had in our region that were a risk similar to this one. And I'm trying to advance, but it's not letting me. Is it advancing for you all? No. Okay. Well. There we go. Did it work? Okay, great. So, after that spill had occurred and, while we were still in emergency mode, I helped write the report Sunken Hazard, which looked at another pipeline we discovered, an Enbridge pipeline called Line 5, obviously. This pipeline, Enbridge was announcing that they wanted to increase the capacity on this pipeline by 50,000 barrels per day while they were sucking oil out of the bottom of the Kalamazoo River. What was so shocking about that was that Line 5 is 15 years older than the one that just ruptured. And of course, we learned that it crosses somehow through the Straits of Mackinac. Well, we didn't know at the time how it was crossing the Straits of Mackinac. So we were very concerned about them wanting to increase pressure on it. But then even more concerned when we discovered the federal agency that oversees pipelines really didn't have very many questions for Enbridge. They made them do a few small tests. One test actually turned up a spill on Line 5, and then they let them turn up the pressure on Line 5 without understanding the real cause of the Line 6B spill while they were still sucking oil out of that river, and while we were real-time experiencing how ill-prepared they were for an actual release. So it was a really frustrating situation. We dove into Line 5 and, the rest is history. We also worked with the University of Michigan to uncover how oil would move in this location. And this was probably the most scary part of this whole research project, was seeing how fast product would swiftly move between both Lakes Michigan and Huron because the currents in that location oscillate back and forth every few days. Not only that, they oscillate back and forth at different depths and different directions. So there's no way possible to predict where an oil spill will go. And it doesn't go east to west, it goes north, south, every direction, sometimes multiple directions in a day. So up to 700 miles of shoreline are at risk from a rupture of Line 5. And, a rupture is not a vague thing. We know we've had 3 cable and anchor strikes on Line 5, one of which was caused by Line 5 or caused by Enbridge's own activity in the area. And they didn't detect several of them. Similarly to not detecting the Line 6B spill when that happened for 17 hours, they had to be told that that spill had occurred. We've also learned that not only is Line 5 a risk at the Straits of Mackinac, we've gone through all of the federal records for Line 5, and there's been over 33 spills. We now know there's 35 spills on Line 5. Over 1 million gallons have been released to date. Enbridge loves to claim that they've never spilled in the Straits of Mackinac, but again, 35 times along the length of their pipeline. And really the only portions of the pipeline that they're even talking about potentially replacing, potentially a decade from now, are the 4 miles at the Straits of Mackinac and another portion of pipeline that I'll talk about in Wisconsin on the Bad River Band's reservation on their land, where they had talked about doing a reroute. But other than that, they have no solution for this already really a decrepit pipeline that runs through hundreds of rivers and streams throughout our Great Lakes. And again, the Kalamazoo River did not happen in the Kalamazoo River. It happened several miles away and ended up impacting 40 miles of that river system because of how poorly we respond to events like this. Oh, and the National Wildlife Federation has always also been at the forefront of talking about what are alternatives to Line 5. And we knew years ago in 2016, 17, 18, that there are alternatives that can go into place immediately for Line 5, including when Enbridge broke Line 6B in 2010, they took that emergency and they really capitalized on it. And I'm not using that word lightly. They capitalized on that emergency. They built a brand new pipeline right next to it that is 36 inches. They doubled the amount of product flowing through that pipeline when it was reconstructed. And so now they had a spill, but they get double the product flowing through Michigan and southern Michigan. And that pipeline has additional capacity that could take the product off of Line 5, goes to the same markets. And we know there are also other opportunities to utilize other forms of energy, including propane is often transported on rail. That is the most common way that it's transported. It's not often transported by a pipeline like Line 5. So we could go back to that, including, or I'll mention that we didn't actually start taking small amounts of propane off of Line 5, and it's less than a percentage of the product on Line 5. We didn't start doing that until 96. So we can go back to utilizing storage in the state and utilizing rail and other modes of transportation, including other pipelines. But most importantly, we're really pushing that we need to start to talk about transitioning. But what is really great about the Line 5 issue is the leadership of these two. When they were elected, they really moved the ball forward. We saw it immediately with A.G. Nessel, where she filed lawsuit that is currently active in federal court right now. We're trying to get that remand back to state court because it is a state issue and it should be heard in the venue of the state of Michigan. Enbridge's delay tactic is to try to remand it to federal court so that they can have a friendlier venue there. But we have really good movement with that particular case coming back. And that case is basically arguing that Line 5 from its beginning, from 1953 and on, has been a violation of public trust because you cannot give industry the bottomlands of the Great Lakes in perpetuity. It's just not something that you can do. It's against public trust law. And so she's standing up for the citizens and their rights to the Great Lakes and to hold that as a resource for all people. Governor Whitmer took time, but she eventually took action as well by revoking the easement in 2020 and then giving Enbridge 6 months to shut down Line 5. Of course, they have continued to operate Line 5, and they have countersued the governor saying that the state of Michigan, despite us having an easement in the state of Michigan that has rights for us to protect the Great Lakes, and it says very clearly that the state of Michigan can revoke the easement if A, B, C, and D are violated, which they have been from the conception. Despite that, Enbridge is trying to claim that federal regulators actually have the most power over Line 5 because they regulate Line 5, but federal regulators have nothing to do with land easements and land contracts. That is a state-based issue. So we are feeling very confident, and we feel our confidence in Enbridge's actions in the last few years, where they have thrown everything at the wall to see what sticks. And you see that with them trying to trigger the Canadian government to also say, no, the state of Michigan cannot shut down Line 5 because of this 1977 transit treaty that's in place. Once again, that transit treaty, it doesn't take into account other treaty rights, including the tribal treaty rights that far exceed this 1977 transit treaty that was put in place to uplift and support a fossil fuel industry, which is a very odd thing for us to lift up in this moment in time. I'll say it aloud during climate crisis. And then B, it also has clauses in it that very clearly say if there's an environmental or a risk, then there's action that can be taken by states or other agencies. And so, again, all of these things are delay tactics because Enbridge sees the writing on the wall. They are violating the easement. They no longer have an easement. I haven't talked about Bad River Band. I'll get there again, but this is a very real moment where we have a pipeline company that knows they're violating the law, but they're doing everything in their power to sidestep that coming to fruition from the facts in these cases being heard. And it's all a bunch of delay tactics, which I'll get to. And then I'll get to some of our action items that we have to try to move this forward in this motion. I'm going to skip some of these. I'm moving through this quite fast because it's a big deck. I mentioned already that we know that Line 5 is a considerable risk. When we first started studying Line 5 and the state had hired Dynamic Risk to look at the risk factors associated with Line 5, the number one thing they said was anchor strikes. And I think they said it was like a 1 in 60-year chance that there would be an anchor strike on Line 5. And then within 3 or 4 months, we had our first anchor strike. And that was the one that was the bounced off of it. We were lucky it did not snag the pipeline where it's actually lifted off the ground. It was able to bounce off of the pipeline and move on without severing it. So it was a real near miss. And then a year later, almost to the day, Enbridge discovered this, which is another clear hit to the pipeline. It moved it several feet, destroyed an anchor support that was on the pipeline. And then another few months later, after this, they dropped an anchor right in between the pipelines and almost hit the two pipelines that are in this location. So we know this is a risk. We know that Enbridge can't necessarily control this, and we have some urgency. And that's what the governor and the attorney general have been really doing in these last few years, is putting some urgency behind it. We're also seeing a lot more citizen action with Enbridge violating the revoked easement that the governor has put out there. Enbridge's illegal operation of Line 5 without an easement in the state of Michigan, as well as the Bad River Band, which I'll talk about in a second. This is a real moment in history where you have a fossil fuel corporation that is right now in court arguing that the state of Michigan has no rights to protect the Great Lakes, that the federal agencies preempt them, and that citizens' rights in the Great Lakes are not valid in this moment. And if you contrast that to what we saw just a few months ago with the Norfolk rail disaster, where you have rail, first of all, we'll start with the rail workers trying to prevent a disaster. They tried very hard to have their voice heard, and they were blocked by that. And then we saw what happened. And in that emergency mode, when the rail disaster happened, you saw the governor of Ohio really say, no, we handle this. And the federal government said, yeah, you have state rights. you can handle this, you can do this. And we also saw in that moment that that was the wrong move, and Ohio was not prepared at all for that. And so you have a state where the president of the United States is saying, you can deal with this disaster, it's fine. You have states' rights, you have to do it. And then you have the governor of Michigan saying, oh, well, we have a state right as well. And we want to protect the Great Lakes. We want to prevent the next Norfolk disaster. And she's been calling on Biden to do that for months, years now, to get in front of this and to support states' rights and uplift them and uphold them, because that's what the governor is now fighting Enbridge in federal court to have those rights to prevent a disaster from Line 5, and Biden has been silent. And that is where we are really pushing a lot of our energy right now, is to both get Governor Whitmer to push Biden further and to get Biden to be a lot more outspoken on this, because of the way Enbridge has manipulated this entire issue with their delay tactics in a way that puts almost all of the balls now in Biden's court. And I'll get to that in just a second. One of the tactics that Enbridge has put on the table, which I'm sure everyone has heard of, is this tunnel proposal. And it was proposed under the Snyder administration when Enbridge saw the writing on the wall. They had 2 Democratic women elected that were running on a Line 5 shutdown platform. And so they put through a really sneaky, awful deal with Governor Snyder. It was against his entire task force's recommendations. And Snyder said basically that Enbridge can have, if they promise to think about building this tunnel someday, they can have the easement in perpetuity. And there were deals made where it is really hard to shut down Line 5 while they're pursuing the tunnel. And so this has been a whole nother legal battle on top of, it has given Enbridge a whole big talking point about how they're going to build a tunnel. It's the alternative. It is going to be the savior to Line 5. It's going to create jobs, and it's going to make it so our energy prices don't go high up, even though we know they won't go up if Line 5 is shut down. But this tunnel has become such a problem because many of us have always known it's been quite a facade. Enbridge has never put a real price tag to it. When they did the core sampling at the front of the tunnel proposal, they did half of what is recommended for a project that is the first of its kind. If they were just doing a most basic tunnel, one that we've done a million times, they would have done a lot more core sampling. So we knew at the very beginning that they may not be serious about this. And then we started to see the permits roll through, and we saw how they were breaking up the permits and actually causing delay on their own through the permit process. And we knew what was happening. They set up this tunnel to be this quote unquote alternative so that every decision maker down the road would hesitate to shut down Line 5, thinking that this was coming and that Enbridge had a plan. But the truth is, the only plan they have, and I'm being really blunt about this because it's become such an offensive play for them, the only play they have with this is to create this illusion of an alternative so that they can delay any action on Line 5. And that is what we are in the middle of right now, is just all of these delay tactics being thrown at the wall because Enbridge makes $2 million every day that Line 5 continues to operate. And without any real teeth from the federal government to force them to adhere to easements or to fight them when they're trespassing on tribal land, the political will is not there right now, as well as so much of the policy that is needed is not in the sphere right now to have these types of healthy transitions from dangerous infrastructure. And so we are in a tricky situation where we've got to get to Biden and really have an educational moment with him. And I'll get to how we are doing that in just a second. But another reroute that I've talked about is the Bad River Band. And this case is so interesting, and one that I just want to flag as something to keep an eye on. The Bad River Band is a tribe in Wisconsin that has a reservation just by the Apostle Islands. And they have Line 5 running through it. I don't know if folks can see my cursor, but this right here is Line 5 running through their reservation. And the Bad River, has several oxbows that are about to breach, and the pipeline is going to become exposed and be a threat to their entire reservation. The Enbridge is also in violation of the easement. The easement expired over a decade ago, and they are not renewing it. A judge has found Enbridge to be an active trespass, and there is currently in limbo a decision on how the remedy is going to go. But again, Enbridge seeing the writing on the wall and knew that they were going to be shut down because the tribe was not going to renew their easements. They proposed a reroute around the reservation, but squarely still within all of the tribal treaty protected waters. And in fact, their proposed route is even more offensively in the tribal protected waters, and could cause a breach in multiple areas, even more than what's on the current reservation. And so we view this as a really strong environmental justice attack by Enbridge to try to harm the tribe while the tribe is trying to also defend their rights. But it's also created yet another delay tactic in the decision making, and it took a whole army of attorneys to help the Bad River Band fight the judge in allowing Enbridge to operate this pipeline until the reroute is built. And now we know after months that agencies are speaking out against this reroute about how horrible it is. It's now been looped into the federal EIS that's being tied to the Line 5 tunnel because it has been so poorly managed. And we know that there will be significant delays with this. And so we are very hopeful that the judge for the Bad River Band's case will no longer look at the reroute as, again, another alternative or solution to this absurd pipeline that frankly should have never been put into operation and in this location to begin with. So this will be a really interesting case. We thought the judge would rule on this months ago, so it could come at any moment. In addition to him deciding when Line 5 will vacate the reservation, he will also decide how much Enbridge has to compensate the tribe for illegally trespassing and profiting off of Line 5 since 2012 and 13. Here are some images of the exposed pipeline on the tribe's land already. And then they have several oxbows that are about to cut off. And that means the pipeline is becoming extremely exposed currently and could become unsupported, as well as they're having their spring thaw. And this is a very wild river. And so if that pipeline becomes exposed at all to the river itself, it'll have debris that is moving down it and hitting it as well. So they do have an emergency injunctive order on Enbridge. The Bad River Band has an active emergency injunctive order that's pending. The judge has basically said, once this oxbow exposes the pipeline, he will shut it down. And that could be the end of Line 5. It'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. And that could happen as early as the spring. I sat in the trial this last fall, and he said the experts that he had on said that could happen as early as this spring. So it's a really dangerous situation. It's an awful situation to put the tribe in to have to monitor this. But it's something that will hopefully prevent a larger disaster by monitoring it. And I mentioned a lot of the court cases. I'm nearing the end here. Nestle versus Enbridge, that again is being remanded back, or trying to get that remanded back to state court. Enbridge versus Michigan is where they're trying to claim that the federal agencies preempt state rights, basically. And then Bad River Band versus Enbridge, this is where the Bad River Band is fighting for their sovereignty and their land right against Enbridge's operation of Line 5. And I'll just say, it was really disheartening to sit in this particular trial, because I watched Enbridge not only go after their sovereignty, and I'm a little congested, I'm sorry. They not only went after their sovereignty, but they had also tried to get the judge to block the Bad River Band from opposing the reroute, which is a violation of their First Amendment rights. So it was a really eye-opening moment to see Enbridge go after so many things, so many rights that citizens have in order to operate this pipeline. And I'll also say, you know, they're arguing in federal court that they have the right to operate this pipeline until there is a failure, that there is no agency that has authority to actually shut them down. And that is a really alarming energy and environmental policy structure for the United States to have in place. And I'll also say that, we're doing a lot right now. Biden is talking a lot about a clean energy transition and a clean energy revolution and a just transition. But if we're unwilling to really have a hard conversation about a pipeline that should have never been put in place in the first place, is 70 years old, has far exceeded its lifespan, as a massive risk to 20% of the world's freshwater, people's drinking water, tribal treaty rights, and has alternatives that can be put in place within months and have little to no effect on the consumers. If we're unwilling to have a conversation about shutting this particular pipeline down, how can we take any administration seriously about a clean energy transition? I'm having a really hard time getting over this, because I can't connect the dots and how we're going to really make this move if we can't even do it. And if Enbridge is successful in any of these cases and any of the claims they're bringing, it is a massive problem for rights as citizens, as well as our efforts to move forward in a climate crisis. So I'll stop by saying that Biden and Canada, because they evoked this treaty, are really the top decision makers at this point. Governor Whitmer is probably closest to Biden, and so we really need to keep pushing her. Here are the action items I would put in front of you. Tell President Biden to speak up for state and tribal rights and sovereignty, and to support a regional economic solution. And what I mean by a regional economic solution is an orderly shutdown of Line 5. It's utilizing systems that we know are already in place that have capacity, and really starting that transition before we have a disaster, which we know is a looming risk every day. And let's not wait 10 years to potentially build an oil tunnel underneath the Great Lakes, record-breaking project to prolong the life of what will be an 80-year-old pipeline. It just makes zero sense whatsoever. So we need to talk about this regional economic solution to Biden. We also need to get to the members of Congress and talk to them about this regional economic solution, talk to them about how the tunnel is not a true alternative. It is not reality. It has not been proven feasible at all. I also encourage everybody to join Oil and Water Don't Mix if you haven't. They're a great grassroots organization that's constantly pushing out action items. In about the next year, it's quite a ways out, we think that the first EIS, so environmental impact statement draft, will be out on the tunnel, which again will include the reroute of the Bad River Band reservation around the Bad River Band reservation, if the project doesn't die before then. We also have opportunities to talk before the Michigan Straits Corridor Authority. They're meeting June 6th. Up at the Straits of Mackinac. They are overseeing this tunnel project. There are 2 new appointees on the Mackinac Strait Corridor Authority that are really holding Enbridge's feet to the fire. They are saying you have to prove feasibility. You also have to prove that you are accounting for this, and that you are talking to your shareholders, and you're talking to your board, and that you're serious about this project. So it's exciting that the governor has put in place a couple new decision makers that are taking this very seriously. And then supporting the Bad River Band and tribal actions. They need resources. If you know of anybody that is supporting financially tribes, especially tribes fighting for their sovereignty, please reach out to me and I'll put you in touch with them. But their legal case is so incredibly expensive, and they're anticipating an appeal process that'll be equally as expensive, and they don't have resources for this. There's some attorneys that have been working pro bono, but that's coming to an end. So we really need to support them in this moment. And then the upcoming election is going to be huge on this. If Line 5 is not shut down from rupture or court order by then, it is going to be a massive topic in this next upcoming election, not only with the gubernatorial races, but I would suspect that this will be a big topic in congressional races as well, including the upcoming Senate race. So keep talking about how important it is to protect the Great Lakes. We have to hold polluters and corporations accountable when they're breaking laws. those are my top actions for everyone. Happy to take questions. And I know I skipped a lot. This is an issue that I could talk about for hours. So I apologize that I skipped so much.
Well, you do an amazing job when you're rushing, and it's, and it's still so clear. So thank you so much. That was a lot of really good information, and we really appreciate your time. A few questions from, oh, there goes Mike again. Have at it, Mike.
Might go up to the.
Are there buoys out there in the straits that mark it so that boats don't, or motor vessels don't drop their anchors? Is there any kind of warning information? And it runs, it's actually, that line is older than the Mackinac Bridge.
Yeah, it's funny. There were none. There were no warnings whatsoever. It didn't even appear on a map, evidently. And so when that first anchor strike happened, Gary Peters, Senator Peters, as well as the Coast Guard, really put into place some action items, as well as Enbridge, who was under fire. They created this anchor watch program, but reality is the boats and vessels, and many of them have spoken out against this. They have their own liability. So if they're in really bad weather, or if their vessel loses power, or whatever the case might be, if they have to drop anchor for safety reasons, they have to drop anchor for safety reasons. There's nothing Enbridge can do. And oftentimes those kind of events happen during really bad weather. And so, yeah, Enbridge can create these smoke and mirror anchor programs where they're telling vessels to make sure their anchors are up. That's great. They should have been doing that to begin with, but it doesn't really prevent a disaster from happening.
I'm just talking about a temporary stop, that something is better than nothing, if they know where it is, but you're saying there's no buoy markers out there.
Yeah, well, I don't know, there may be something on the shorelines, but if you've ever been in the straits, it's really hard to see the shorelines.
Yeah.
So what they're relying on is a lot of digital correspondence.
Any other questions?
Isn't there a lot of protective coating missing from prior anchor strikes that were never reported?
Yeah, we actually don't have a straight answer on what's causing the coating to fail. But yeah, it's part of the easement violation. So Enbridge is required to have 3 layers of protective coating. We know from the beginning that 1 layer failed from the start. And then some of the more critical layers now, so the enamel, as well as some of the coal tar, unfortunately, is what they used. That has started to peel away. Some theories are the quagga mussels are peeling it off with weight. Currents have peeled it off. Anchor strikes have peeled it off. The anchor supports that they put on the pipeline they've found has rubbed the coating away. And all of this is to say, it's so clear to us that Enbridge is not in a position where they can manage this pipeline safely anymore. Every time they go into the Straits of Mackinac, they're discovering something new, some new problem. And they can only monitor the pipeline. They can only actually physically see the pipeline 6 months out of the year because of the weather conditions in this location. So the whole monitoring and response thing is, it's wild to me that we are allowing this to continue to operate. I'll just say that.
Isn't that coating to prevent corrosion of the pipeline?
Yeah,
Coating to prevent the corrosion of the pipeline.
I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of
The coating to prevent corrosion of the pipeline.
Yeah, and I'll give an example. So with line 6B, the protective coating on the outside of the pipeline failed when the weld that was on the pipeline created a tent effect where the protective coating was not actually touching the pipe. So things got into the pipeline, like water, debris got into it, caused cracks. Over time, those cracks fused into one, created a 6-foot gash that we now know was the rupture that caused that spill. So when you have failures in this coating, or gaps in the coating, it only allows corrosion to occur. And we already know from the inline inspections and reports that they've provided to the public that there are known features on the pipeline. They call them anomalies, dents, cracks, as well as bends. And so, yeah, this having the protective coating fail is not a small problem. That is a massive problem, and is why the governor named it in part of her easement revocation.
One more question, Mike?
It's a quick 3-part.
Oh,
You're
yeah.
out of you're out of
Well, you're the one who wants to stay late for the
They're-
business
they're-
meeting. It's okay.
They're Canadian out of Calgary, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's the diameter? I know you mentioned it before. Is it one pipeline or are there 2 there?
No, I'm sorry. There's, when it's inland, so all through the UP, it's one pipeline, 30 inches. And then when it cuts through the Straits of Mackinac, they turn it into 2 20-inch pipelines. And then when it gets back onto the inland portion of the lower peninsula, it goes back to a 30-inch pipeline.
Okay, and then the last question is, who is the largest shareholder in the company? I looked them up and it had Amazon down, but I don't think that's right. They talk about.
I just looked this up the other day. It's like all the people that own
Indian
everything
tribes.
else.
Indian
Yeah.
tribes.
I can get you a list of oh gosh, if you were to name like those 3 or 4 corporations that own everything, it's them. BlackRock, Vanguard, all of them.
Thank you.
And then I think there's some weird investments in them, but there's a shareholder strategy. So if you Google shareholder resolutions, Enbridge, there's a group that's been going after them on line 5, particularly because of the way that some human rights issues, as well as the way they're using the treaty.
Thank you.
And then I'll also name last week 51 tribes and First Nations filed a UN submission of human rights violation with the UN against Enbridge because of line 5, because of their legal attacks and their efforts to dismantle both state and tribal sovereignty in order to keep line 5 running. So that'll be something to watch. And they will be at a tribal summit next week. So there may be some additional attention on that.
Well, thank you so much, Beth. That's been amazing. I know I will be watching the recording to get this freshest in my head when I try to contact my representatives, because this is just you made it so understandable. This was a wealth of information. So thank you so much. And I'm sorry you felt rushed, but you did an amazing job. So thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. And I will get you just to share with everybody this economic solution that we put together. We have a couple, they're really wonky and thick, but if you just hand them to congressional members, it gives them a breakdown on how we can transition from line 5. It's a step-by-step process on how we can.
Fantastic. We'll be sure if we can archive that and we can get if there's a link where people can download it themselves, we'll put it out in our newsletter and on our website.
Thank you so
much. I knew she was cool. She's a kayaker. All right.